It's a charming story, huh? It's a parable, right? So it's a parable. It's important that we understand it's a parable. It's a story told by a wisdom teacher to challenge us, to kind of rough us up. So it's not an allegory. Let me just go ahead and let's just say this. The king is not God. It's a parable. It's not an allegory. So when we're faced with a parable, especially a good rough one like this from Jesus, first thing to do is relax. What do I mean by that? You're all God's kids. Me too. We're all God's kids, which means we are all infinitely loved, and we live our lives in the safety of that love. Does that make sense? So now that we're kind of relaxed, now we let the parable happen to us. Parables, as I say, are meant to challenge so that we might grow. I know I'm not the only one in this room who wants to grow into a better version of himself, am I? Anybody in here want to grow? Okay, good. We got a few in the back that want to grow. This is for you. No. Okay, so when I let this parable happen to me, this is what happened. Myrtle Mosier. Myrtle Mosier was the oldest, kindest, and wisest member of our church when I was a little boy. I grew up down in Roswell, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. And I saw Myrtle Mosier all the time because every Sunday I went to St. David's Episcopal Church where my father served as the priest and rector. It was not a choice. I was not a pious little boy. I was made to go to church. And that's where I met Myrtle Mosier, the oldest, wisest, and kindest member of our church. Now my father loved life. He's in heaven now. I imagine he loves that too. But he loved being alive. And he was fully convinced that life itself and the whole world all around us was a wedding banquet thrown by God. And he was fully convinced further, he knew, that is, in his heart of hearts, that he was invited to the wedding banquet. And so, y'all got to believe me here. He got up every day and he accepted the invitation. He also, by the way, sidebar, believed that you all are invited to the wedding banquet too. Now, my old man was the most extroverted person that God has ever made. He has a granddaughter, Mary, who is second place. I'm not an extrovert. I'm actually an introvert, but I was raised by a pure extrovert, which meant that my dad had friends everywhere he went. If he didn't have friends in the place we were going, he did by the time that he left. I'd be like, Dad, how do you know the person who's applying for a job at the Winn-Dixie as we come here to buy milk? How do you know the guy out behind the bank? How do you know the person taking our order at the McDonald's? He'd always answer the same way. Son, these are all my friends, my best friends in many cases. So it was no mystery then that Myrtle Mosier loved my father. And he, of course, loved her. Now, when I was a little boy, we were very well provided for. I had the best parents you could imagine having. But for whatever reason, in my little boy mind, I remember our car used to break down relatively frequently. And one time, when the family car was broken down and was in the shop, Myrtle Mosier called my dad up on the telephone. And he said, Father Hendree, while your car is down, you can borrow my truck. And that's how my dad came to be driving Myrtle Mosier's little Ford pickup truck through the parking lot of the Roswell Village Shopping Center one sunny afternoon. He had left work to run an errand. He had finished with his errand, and he was headed back to the church. And when he told this story after it all happened, he said that it seemed like the car crash, happened in slow motion. Like he could see it all coming, but was powerless to prevent it. He couldn't even honk the horn. He had been driving through the parking lot, And a car backed up, apparently without looking or anyway not seeing, and just collided with the front of Myrtle Mosier's little Ford pickup truck, busted out the front headlight on the passenger side, and crumpled the right front quarter panel. My father wasn't hurt, nor was the other driver, but his heart sank immediately to the floorboard of Myrtle Mosier's little truck. And when the bang happened, his mind immediately went to Myrtle Mosier and her generosity. And then he got angry. He got angry. Both cars are stopped now. My old man jumps out of that little truck. He races around to the front of it to look at the damage. Very animated he was. And the driver of the other car, he said, got out and walked rather sheepishly toward my father. And when they got within hearing distance, my dad lit into this man. Now, I'm not going to take you through the whole monologue my dad gave in the parking lot that day because we're in church and it was rough. But suffice it to say, he was not his best self in that moment. He used, by his own account, some coarse language and a very heated tone, which was unusual, of course, because my old man was as friendly as they come. Now, when he was finished blessing the guy out, my dad had a final line that he shouted at the guy, finger pointing. He said, "The thing that really gets me is that you caused this wreck, and you're just standing there like a bump on a log, not saying a single word. Aren't you even going to say you're sorry?" My father shouted at this man. And that fella stood there and looked at my dad with fear and worry in his eyes, probably thinking, this maniac is going to kill me. And when he spoke, this is what he said. He said, "Mister, I am sorry. It's just that, well, I've never been cussed out by a preacher before." And my dad just stood there in that parking lot, in that shopping center parking lot. My dad just stood there staring at him. And as he stood there staring at this guy who'd backed into him, he saw Myrtle Mosier in his mind's eye as she was smiling. And then as he was standing there staring at that guy, taking in this "I've never been cussed out by a preacher" message, he heard the words of Jesus, my dad did, whisper in his ear. "Love one another as I have loved you." And he stood there a little longer. I've never been cussed out by a preacher before. He stood there a little longer, and my dad remembered the words of the Apostle Paul. "Above all, clothe yourselves. Clothe yourselves in love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." And then my father said, "How do you know I'm a preacher?" And the man just stared at him. Dad said the man seemed confused and scared. And then the man just kind of looked my dad up and down, didn't say a word. And then my dad looked down at himself. He was wearing a dark preacher's suit, what he always wore to work. He closed his eyes and put his hand to his neck. Darn it. He was wearing that starch white preacher's collar. Then he lowered his right hand to his chest and he fingered the cross this cross, this exact cross. And he realized, my old man realized that he was at the wedding banquet. All life was a wedding banquet. That he was at the wedding banquet. And he was dressed like a priest. But he was not wearing his wedding robe. And for a split second, my father was torn away from that sunny afternoon, just ripped out of the day. And he was thrown for a split second out of the banquet hall into the cold outer darkness where there was weeping indeed and gnashing of teeth indeed. And in that moment, my father was unmoored and spinning, and noise filled his ears. And then he remembered. See, my old man was a prisoner of hope, just like y'all. And he remembered. He remembered, Joyce, he remembered himself. Who he was and who he belonged to. And he opened his mouth and he said the only thing you can say. He said, I'm sorry. He said, I'm sorry. And I beg your forgiveness. He said, this is not my truck. It's borrowed from the dearest friend I have in this world. And now it's crashed and I'm scared, and when I get scared, sometimes anger blooms and I let it get the best of me. I'm sorry, friend. Please forgive me. And just like that, he was back. And he put on the clothes of gentleness. Y'all, he put on the outer robe of humility. He put on the wedding robe of love. He put on his wedding robe. And when he did, he felt the heat of the day back on his face. He felt his anger dissolve. He felt that hard old heart soften. And the man who'd crashed into Myrtle Mosier's truck said to him the only thing there is to say. He said, it's okay. No, brother, I get it. It's okay. I accept your apology, and I'm sorry too. I'm sorry too. And the very next Sunday, I don't know, I guess it was a few days later, the very next Sunday, my dad got up in front of St. David's Episcopal Church down there in Roswell, Georgia. And he told that story on himself during the sermon. And Myrtle Mosier was in church that morning. And Myrtle Mosier was sitting in church in her usual pew. And she smiled as my dad made his confession. And she admired the wedding robe that he was preaching in. And afterwards, people at the church, in a well-meaning way, they asked old Myrtle Mosier about her truck. Boy, Hendree, in your truck. She didn't say much when they asked her. Oh, she didn't hardly say anything at all when they asked her. She just smiled. Because the wisest among us, the ones who are really dressed up in love. No, the wisest among us, y'all, they don't criticize. The wisest among us, they don't correct. Oh, no, the ones that are dressed up in that wedding robe like Myrtle Mosier, they don't cut us down to size, baby. No. Because they know that life does that well enough. No, the wisest ones, the ones who've really gone the distance with God. I'm not there, but I want to go there one day before I die. They get up every day I'm not there, but I want to be there one day before I die. They get up every day and they put on their wedding robe. And before their feet hit the floor, they smile. And they commit themselves. They trust God. And they enjoy the party. And they do the only thing we really need to do, which is lift each other up with the warm, warm love of Jesus. Because they know the wisest among us, they know that all of life is a banquet and that everybody's invited. Just put on your wedding robe. And that's what you hear from them if you listen. I think you can hear it from the saints in heaven. My old dad and all your people. Myra. I think if we'll listen, we'll hear them from heaven saying, hey, y'all, put on your wedding robes. Don't forget to put on your wedding robes. Because, see, we're Christians. We're Christians. And the world needs us to be dressed in our best.